Cyber attacks are hitting harder and faster than ever. So the real question is, how prepared are you? In 2024, the average time from initial breach to full ransomware deployment was just 17 hours. And in some cases, it took as little as 4. Hackers are evolving, targeting MSPs, abusing trusted tools, and bypassing security defenses faster than ever before. To break it all down, I'm joined by Greg Linares and Ethan Tancredi from Huntress. Hi, you two.
Hello.
Hello.
Greg, let's start with the big picture. What are the biggest takeaways from Huntress's 2025 Cyber Threat Report? What should MSPs be most concerned about?
I think right now the big focus should be that attackers are moving fast, like you mentioned earlier. And previously, we used to see a gap between where sophisticated attackers would deploy a method or a technology that they use to compromise machines. And then we would see that eventually trickle down into the common everyday plans. And unfortunately, that gap has closed massively. And what used to be months and potentially a year between that, we're seeing weeks now, where the big sophisticated attacks are being cut down, implemented, deployed, and used within weeks of initial discovery and initial usage. So what we're seeing with that, it's MSPs and everyone has to be vigilant is the big one on that one.
We know cyber criminals don't take a one-size-fits-all approach. Which industries were hit the hardest in 2024, and how were they targeted?
Well, that's a good question because we at Huntress, we monitor several industries. And in that, we look at healthcare, we look at government, we look at manufacturing, education. And this year, we saw a lot being hit in education and healthcare. We saw a majority of attacks being targeted those. And it's because the attackers are winning in those, unfortunately.
Ethan, MSPs serve a variety of industries, and each one has different security needs. What should MSPs be doing differently based on these attack patterns?
Well, what's really critical is that MSPs need to understand the industries they are serving. So are they protecting healthcare? Are they protecting education? Is it government? Because once you understand the crown jewels, for lack of a better description, you're going to be able to understand that risk and the risk profile from it. Greg, in the report, healthcare and education, you talked about it. It was the largest. They were like a third of the attacks, right?
38%. Yeah.
Yeah. So like a significant amount is still in there. So if you have a healthcare, a pediatrician's office, a local school district, you need to understand what their constraints are, right? Healthcare, obviously, threat actors are going to be looking for information around patient confidentiality, things like that. Greg's alluded to, data exfiltration and data being part. That's going to be part of there. Education, you're going to need to be putting in place security measures for somebody who probably has a limited budget. And so you need to customize and tailor your tooling to the right protection for that industry. Government is another one, right? Where threat actors, Greg, remind me in the report, it was something around like 20+% of the time for info stealers being used against government, right?
Yeah, let me give you the exact number about that. But for government, it was quite a bit. It was 21%.
Yeah, so like 21% of the time, you're having, threat actors stealing information. Why? Because that's a rich environment for data that you can pivot and move further, right? You can take that county treasurer's information and do some other attack, whether they're getting credentials, et cetera. So understanding what you are protecting is going to allow you to put in place the effective controls to protect it at a cost basis that your clients can afford. And that's the key thing that you need to take away from the report.
Ransomware is evolving, and your report points to some alarming shifts. Greg, what's changed in the past year, and how are attackers adapting?
So in the last year, even recently, we've seen some pretty big takedowns, and that has caused groups to splinter like they always do. However, what attackers are now doing is they're changing their tactics in order to maximize profits. And in some cases, they're actually they're removing ransomware out of the picture and just stealing data and extorting it. So we're seeing groups that are moving away from ransomware, and because that's where they know they get caught. When their ransomware is deployed, they're actually prevented and blocked. That's good on us. We're doing well in the industry. So instead of that, they're stealing data and using that as holding that and saying, hey, if you want your data not to leak, you get to pay up this money. So that's where the extortion is coming in. Ransomware operators are also using, like I said, more sophisticated methods. They are using a lot of ways to bypass EDR and do other tactics that we saw exclusively in ABT engagements only.
One of the key findings in this report is time to ransom. And some attacks happen in as little as 4 hours, like we talked about before. What does this mean for MSPs, and how do they need to adapt?
We've been seeing this trend, and this was an interesting survey that we were able to do with our data. And let me explain how this actually we were able to calculate this. And this is from the very first action we saw, the very first offensive action that we were believed to be part of the campaign. It could have been a malicious download, a stolen credential, and the trend is the attackers are getting in, and this is sometimes done by another group. Might be an initial access broker or another group that's actually breaks into the victim. And then a couple hours later, after they sold the credential, sold access, the ransomware group or the other operators go in or hands-on keyboard activity and start going through. With this, we've noticed that some groups are taking longer time to ransom. And those tend to be the groups that are also doing double extortion. They're gonna ransom your data, and they're going to steal your data, and then, like I mentioned earlier, extort you for it as well. Other groups, that also is a key to show how efficient groups are getting. The more aggressive groups are going in and they're doing their homework before. They're doing OSINT investigations on the victims. They know who's at the company. They know what they do. So they're targeting individuals very, very fast. We watch them pivot very fast and move from resource to resource. And then they are ransoming very quickly because they know that window, as soon as they go in, the window they have, the opportunity is getting shorter because EDR and defenses are getting better. So the most successful groups we notice tend to be on the shorter side.
MSPs rely on remote monitoring and management tools to support their clients, but cybercriminals are using those same tools against them. Ethan, how is RMM abuse happening, and what can MSPs do about it?
So I'll let Greg chime in a little bit here, potentially, if he wants to, about the actual techniques that are happening. I can talk on a high level, which is how they are doing it. One, they're using hijacked versions that they just are cracking and deploying. Maybe through a social engineering attack, we call you up, Sydney, and we say, hey, Sydney, I'm with your local MSP. I impersonate you, and I need you to remote on. And, oh, my tool isn't working. Here, help me. And they will use a hijacked version and attack that way. So that's one way. Maybe they'll send a phish to start that, call to help install the tooling. Another way, though, is they're going to do a compromise. I mean, last year, 2024, we had the Screen Connect vulnerability where there was a major vulnerability that multiple, MSPs had it cracked because of a vulnerability. It doesn't happen often. But if you have one of those, that's going to be critical to be aware of, and that you are hardening your RMM tools. Like, you need to think of it as, from an MSP standpoint, that's probably your most powerful tool, that if a threat actor can get into that tool, they can pivot throughout all of your clients and launch all of those things we as an MSP did. I mean, I ran all sorts of commands. I deployed software through it. Well, it's a great tool to deploy ransomware through your RMM tool. So it should go without saying that, yes, you need 2FA on that RMM tool, right? But you need to be aware of session token theft. Like, there are ways to steal these things potentially. And probably the final thing I want for advice to how do you harden your own RMM tool is, like, if you are self-hosting your solution, you need to make sure you are patching immediately and paying attention to those noses that come out. That becomes a huge risk factor from it.
Yeah. To add on to that, the attackers are also just bringing their own because they know that RMM tools are trusted. So in an environment, they'll do the research and figure out, oh, this victim uses this RMM tool and I can laterally move throughout the network using that RMM tool. So they'll use it or bring another one. It's just hidden in the noise at that point. And as you mentioned earlier, a big thing would be for MSPs to make sure that when they have credentials and for each of their clients with their RMs, to make sure they're unique, because that is not always the case and unfortunate. And that where they store those credentials are also well hidden, well regarded, and protected extremely, because attackers are going after MSPs and targeting them for those credentials themselves.
You said it yourself. We know MSPs are high-value targets for attackers because they provide access to multiple businesses. What are some of the biggest mistakes MSPs make that leave them vulnerable, and how can they avoid them?
One of the key mistakes I see over and over is where they don't have their security tools on all of the all of the machines. Either in a deployment, a machine is missing tools for whatever reason, or they've made the tactical decision to only protect the quote unquote critical machines. Well, yes, you were protecting the critical machine, but a threat actor loves a machine without security tools because now they have a foothold. They can sit there all day and pound away on it. The second biggest thing is not educating their employees on the threat risk that MSPs are, where they aren't teaching, they're not creating a culture of cybersecurity where there's this awareness in their own MSP. We see employees, for instance, download and use fake tools regularly, and that's indicating of a lack of training where, in your RMM tool, we talked about a moment ago, right? RMM tool, super powerful, but you can pre-stage tools like an IP scanner. But I have seen, and I'm sure Greg has more evidence to this, of, a fake IP scanner is deployed by a tech who's in a rush, who Googles it and grabs the first one in the list. And sure enough, SEO poisoning has happened, and they download and run a malicious tool that has a Trojan, something built in the background. So that is critical. A third thing that MSPs don't do, especially ones who have a culture of cybersecurity awareness, is that they don't restrict rights on their normal user accounts. So what I mean by that is that I have definitely seen MSPs where one of the things we do, we protect, identities through Microsoft 365. To do that, you have to install as a global admin in our process. I've seen techs who are like, oh no, I'm a global admin. I'll just log in with my Tancredi at Huntress Labs account. And I'm like, oh my goodness, you are running around with a account as your daily driver that, going back to those info stealers, right? They grab those credentials. Suddenly, your daily driver is out there ready to be used against every one of your clients. And then the final thing is that MSPs are not thinking about how do we do patching when there is a mass vulnerability out there. Probably the biggest one, and I experienced this on myself. I was at an MSP. We were a large Sonic wall shop, and a vulnerability came out, and suddenly we had 200 Sonic walls that we needed to patch in quickly because I think it was a CVE 9 point something had been dropped on it. 200 firewalls for even a large MSP is going to take a lot of man hours to go and do. And so how are you limiting your exposure to a critical CVE? You have to imagine it's going to happen to everything. So are you, restricting access to admin interfaces? Are you putting in place ways that are going to limit your exposure? So when a CVE happens, you maybe have runtime to get out there ahead of it. And so, you can give yourself a week's runtime instead of having to pivot immediately that night. So those are some key things I think, or mistakes I've seen MSPs make, where they don't think about how to really restrict and keep those things cordoned off, for lack of a better description.
Another trend in the report is EDR tampering. You spoke about this a little bit, but attackers are shutting down security tools before launching attacks. What are the most common ways they're doing this? And what's the best way to fight back?
Right now, attackers are implementing a method called BYOVD, or bring your own vulnerable driver. And that is absolutely the most common way that they're doing it. And using this, they're able to take a driver that is trusted. Often we see scenarios of this being other defense companies, such, EDR companies, that their drivers are vulnerable to being installed and abused, as well as game development drivers are often, and just cleaning tools and other drivers, even some utilitarian tools are being used to take. And they take these drivers, they install them, and they run the commands that they run at higher privileges, and that allows them to disable EDR and other protections on the victim's machine. And right now, it's a hard battle to win, because even though Microsoft does produce a known vulnerable driver list, and attackers are always finding new ones. However, also another key point is that vulnerable driver list is not updated frequently. So it's up to EDR companies, protection groups, and other people who are security teams to make sure that they manually identify these or keep up to date with these, and issue blocking or block lists for these drivers. It's not an easy problem to solve, and we see attackers they know this, and they're using it, and they know that it's not an easy problem to solve, because if you block the wrong driver, you're going to have a blue screen on machines that actually need it. So it's a hard one to win.
MSPs often ask, what are the must-have security measures to keep clients protected? Based on your research, what should every MSP have in place?
We are a managed EDR solution, so this might sound self-aggrandizing to say this, but at this day and time, a managed EDR with a 24/7 SOC should be considered table stakes. And why is that? Because EDR by itself can get noisy. And if you're not watching it all the time, suddenly your team is coming in Tuesday morning and trying to figure out, okay, which of these alerts are the ones to manage. So I think that becomes a must-have at this point in time. We talk about, the using your RMM to protect and patch, making sure it has the tools in place, but also having those defined patching windows and agreements with your clients. Limiting user rights access, a big attack we're seeing lately, and I don't think it had made into the report because it was just starting to take off, Greg, was fake CAPTCHAs, right? That's now becoming something we're seeing.
Microsoft just issued a fix for some of that, or not a permanent fix for that. But yes, that's a new tactic where attackers are hosting websites and telling victims to press certain key buttons, and it's downloading a malicious PowerShell script and executing a malicious script on their machines. And we saw a little bit at the end of the report, but it was not nearly the case it was. That kicked off in January a lot.
Yeah. And so you can remove the run command from your end users, because end users probably don't need that. I mentioned about, not having your dedicated global admin accounts being your daily use one. And it really comes down to layers of defense becomes key. Whether you're doing something like a DNS filtering solution that you are using on top of your EDR, obviously your next-gen AV, a firewall with IDS and IPS, and then also, are you protecting identity? Because if we've been focused a lot on this conversation about endpoint protection, but identity is becoming that new target. The info stealers, the reason they're grabbing that is they want to pivot over to your identity, because they realize that becomes the way to get in. And identity protection, yes, you need to be looking at that, but also then that becomes building that culture of security awareness, where yes, your traditional, what I'll call security awareness training with phishing campaigns and education, but also things like tabletop exercises. So you can talk to people about, do you have an incident response plan? Do you have a business continuity plan? And have you thought through these things? Because we all talk about it's going to happen. Assume compromise, right? Well, if you assume compromise, then you need to be having these security conversations that get people to think about, oh, what are we going to do when it happens? And how are we preparing for that? And the final part of this is having that relationship with incident response firms built out. Maybe that's through your cyber insurance carrier. If you don't have it, it's building those relationships proactively. And what becomes critical in that how do we deal with it post-compromise is where SIM comes into play of having those logs so that you can get somebody who can look and figure out what they touched. Because when you're dealing with a short time frame, you really want to be able to have as many logs as possible so you can kick them out as quickly as possible.
It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. Now, MSPs often struggle with balancing proactive security and rapid response. What are some key steps they should take in the first few minutes of detecting an attack to minimize damage?
The key thing, in my opinion, is isolating the network because it buys you time. If you can cut off the threat actors' access into the environment, now you can take your time. This is where that business continuity plan comes in place because ideally, I've had that conversation with Greg. Hey, Greg, when something happens, this is what's key for your business for you to make money. Super. I understand that. I can get that system online quickly or have some backup way so that Greg's business can make money because businesses do need to make their money. But now, isolating the network, now you can go and look, hey, have we exposed RDP? Do we have a VPN in place that doesn't have MFA on it? Oh, super. And you can work your way backwards from the machine that's been impacted out to the edge. And so really that isolating the network, yes, it is challenging when you have stopped everybody from working, but that's the key thing you can do and why Huntress relies on that key containment facility so much.
Phishing attacks have evolved. They aren't what they used to be. Greg, what new phishing tactics did Huntress track in 2024? And how can MSPs help their clients stay protected?
Yeah, the two big ones we saw were QR codes being implemented, and we saw that in about 8% of all phishing attempts. And that's where attackers are using a QR code to make it look like another service and saying, hey, you've been logged out, or this action needs to occur immediately. Please log in using this QR code. What's interesting about this attack is since people are using that to use their phone to that, and in many environments, your phone is a lot less doesn't have the EDR and protections that your machine would use. So that people are, quickly seeing QR code and using that to quickly go back and log into their systems. And the attackers are stealing that credential. Those sessions, tokens, and phishing for that information. The other one is living off trusted sites. And that's where attackers are using third-party sites to actually host their own malware and malicious content. And that, for example, using that would be like a document signing company where the attackers are uploading the malicious document to that website and a website's hosting it. So when they go look and get the email, the third-party website is hosting the email and the content. So people are trained to look for malicious URLs or non-trusted locations, but it's all coming from that trusted location. So it all looks good on their side. And attackers love this because it allows them to hide efficiently and the documents look legitimate. And often they will have third or fourth stages on there. If the third-party company does have malicious protection, it will send a link to their third website that they have to, or the second or third website that they have to click to. And by that time, the victims I already only verified the first link. It went to this trusted website that they use. They're not going to check the third or fourth link, in there, and they get compromised that way.
If there's one key piece of advice you'd give to MSPs based on this report, what would it be?
Please install everywhere. Please. As Ethan has mentioned, I have dealt with that a lot in the last year. And I can't tell you how many times where it's because one device or one machine didn't have endpoint protection on it. Install everywhere. Attackers will find that machine and they will live off that machine. They will know. And we have seen so many scenarios where if detection was on that, or if if it was configured correctly, or all the logs were enabled on that machine, we could have prevented an incident. And if I could tell MSPs that one thing, it'd be that, followed by MFA all your access and make sure that your RMM tools are protected because attackers are going after. That is the new hotness right now for all ransomware groups and sophisticated attackers right now, is going after the MSPs directly and targeting them and then using them to target their clients. So that is a big deal right now.
And Sydney, you said only one. That's so hard because there's so many key things to say. But I will keep it to one, which is you really do need to have a 24/7 team looking at the alerts coming from your EDR or ITDR or SIM. You need somebody who is trained in this, looking at them so that remember what Greg talked about, that smaller and smaller attack timeline that's happening. That's why having a team who's there at all times of the night or day, regardless of a holiday, etc., that becomes critical so that you are taking action on the key alerts, not getting burnt out and running after false positives, so that you don't go, oh, they're craying wolf, forget about it, and suddenly you miss the actual report that's in there that's critical. And that team ideally could then isolate those hosts so that it does buy you time, right? So I think that's the key part of why you need to have a 24/7 team on all appliances, all devices, as Greg mentioned. That team then can look at it and protect it, isolate those networks, and give you time to get to root cause.
Some great advice. Thank you, Greg and Ethan, for joining me. The Huntress Cyber Threat Report makes one thing clear. Attackers aren't slowing down, but with the right defenses, MSPs can stay ahead. If you want to dive deeper into the data and insights we discussed today, download the full Huntress 2025 Cyber Threat Report right now at the link below. For the Channel Company, I'm Sydney Neely. Thanks for watching.